Well, look, let's talk more about this, because if we needed more proof that the International Criminal Court bends over to terrorists and is nothing more than a morally bankrupt organisation, look no further than its decision to issue Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with an arrest warrant. And speaking of morally bankrupt, all Penny Wong could muster up was, quote, Australia respects the independence of the ICC. For more, we're now joined by co-CEO of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, Alex Ryvchin. Alex, really good to see you. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Joe Biden, at the very least, made it clear that there is no equivalence, none whatsoever, between Israel and Hamas. What does Australia's response to the ICC's ruling suggest about how it views Israel?
It shows that this government is no friend of Israel. I think we have to now accept that as a reality. And the fact that, as you said, the Biden administration absolutely rejected and repudiated and slammed this decision by the ICC, whereas our own government could say very little. It could at no point confirm or deny whether it's going to arrest the Israeli Prime Minister if he were to try to come to Australia. It's an insane situation, but it's just the latest in a series of slights. So we saw just a few days ago the Australian government deny an entry visa to a former Israeli justice minister who was a minister in a centrist coalition government just a few years ago and who came to our country 18 months ago without any issues. Meanwhile, letting in thousands of Gazans, often unvetted. So we're seeing a pattern of behaviour, both in UN voting in terms of the rhetoric of the government and these sorts of gestures, which suggest that this government does not like the state of Israel. And I think that's really lamentable. It shows a lack of values and a lack of integrity.
Alex, I couldn't agree more. And like you, I think I've been in denial regarding this government. I keep thinking, no, I don't really think they're anti-Israel. The problem is they keep making these decisions. And at some point you have to say, you know what, I think our government really is anti-Israel. On that point, James Patterson, the Coalition Home Affairs spokesperson, he said this morning that he is aware of numbers of Jewish families in Australia now seriously thinking about moving from Australia because they've sniffed the wind and they don't like the direction it's blowing. I've had Jewish families say similar things to me. Can you just help us understand the kinds of conversations Australian Jews are having at the moment about their future in this country?
Well, it's something that all Jews living around the world talk about at one time or another, and that is their security in the country in which they live and what might occur which might force them to take flight. And it seems so fanciful and ludicrous if we were talking about this 18 months ago or a couple of years ago, pre-October 7. But the Jewish people have a deep sense of our history, and we know how quickly things can turn. We know that a mob is a terrifying thing. We know that public opinion can shift and governments often follow that. We've seen Jews stripped of their rights progressively in countries in which they contributed a great deal. And so we live with that. And then post-October 7, seeing what's happened in our own country, seeing the attitudes of many of our fellow Australians. And I have to obviously clarify, very many Australians I know are standing in solidarity and support of our community. And I hear from them on a daily basis. But when you have a government that's so ambiguous when it comes to support for the Jewish community, when you have this policy calibration which sends signals to different parties in our society, when you have this deteriorating situation, there are hard decisions and hard conversations being had. And one might think it's crazy to think that one would be safer in Israel where there's a war going on. But there's something about that country being there. You feel united, you feel part of the people, part of the struggle, and you certainly know that no one's going to pound you with anti-Semitism. And the same can't be said here at the moment. And we see in Montreal and Amsterdam and other Western cities, things can slide very, very quickly. And we got a dose of that in Woollahra just a couple of days ago as well.
Yeah, it's really frightening. And speaking of that, you alluded to it, we saw anti-Israel protests in Canada. Now, they descended into chaos at the weekend and actually turned violent. Have a look at this. I mean, that was just appalling in itself, but what's even more appalling is where was the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau? Well, he was actually dancing at a Taylor Swift concert. Alex, clearly these protests were filled with hate and anti-Semitism, and yet the leader of Canada was out there dancing and taking selfies, and it took him hours upon hours to even release a statement about what was witnessed. How bad of a look is this?
Well, I have to clarify, there's no crime in dancing at a Taylor Swift concert, because I'd be guilty of the same offence, even though those moves are partly criminal, the ones that I saw just there. But the crime is in the fact that Justin Trudeau, and this is reminiscent of our government here, and the Canadian government has largely been in lockstep with Anthony Albanese's government. They've signed a lot of joint letters condemning Israel, articulating their position on the conflict. The fact that he has allowed the situation to descend to such a point where the Jewish community with which I'm in close contact in Canada have been crying out for months and months and months about their schools and their synagogues being firebombed and vandalised, an absolutely unbearable situation on university campuses. It all sounds very reminiscent of our situation here. And the government has done nothing. And we've seen weakness in terms of rhetoric. He was asked a question about the ICC and gave the most waffling, pitiful response one could imagine. And again, when you're dealing with absolute thugs and lowlifes and common vandals, and we saw that there, they're glorifying the final solution. They'll claim they're merely anti-Zionist and anti-Israel, but they're talking about the Nazi program to exterminate the Jews. And these are the people the Western governments are regularly pandering to and recalibrating their policies around. It's scandalous.
It's absolutely scandalous. Speaking of scandalous, Alex, Hamas said today that an Israeli woman held hostage in Gaza since October last year has died. Now, they've not, to my knowledge, named the woman or said how she died, but I wanted to ask you about this because to me the biggest outrage in everything that's happening right now is that this woman is one of 97 Israelis still being held hostage by Hamas terrorists, and the world doesn't seem outraged by that anymore. It's almost like they've been forgotten in all of this.
I think that's a sad reality, that they are forgotten, and we haven't forgotten them. Certainly the Jewish world, we continue to pray for them and work for their release on a daily basis, and good people like yourselves haven't forgotten about them, but our government has forgotten about them. They don't talk about this. They talk about recognising a Palestinian state and arresting the Israeli democratically elected leader if he dares come to the country. This is what they're talking about, and the integrity of the ICC that issues these arrest warrants. Meanwhile, nearly 100 people are languishing in hell, second by second, including children as young as 2 and 5 years old. And the fact that no one is talking about this at a government level, no international action is being done, whether it's the UN or so-called human rights organisations or the Red Cross or our government, that is a national shame. And really, when we see the priorities of this government on the conflict, to take every cheap shot at Canada, Israel, it's an abandonment of those people, those innocent people who are suffering so gravely, so deeply.
Yeah, it really is shocking. Alex Ryvchin, always really good to have you on. Thank you very much for joining us on the show this evening.